Would you dare to speak the truth, even if it meant losing everything? Watch what happens when an ordinary employee stands up to defend his coworker and no one knows he is actually the CEO of the company. The sixth-floor conference room at Ardent Systems was no stranger to tense discussions, but never had the silence felt this heavy. The rhythmic tapping of a pen from an employee in the corner stopped abruptly when Oliver Kane's voice cut through the air, cold and sharp as a whip. "Nora Ellis, do you even understand what responsibility means? A mistake this foolish, and you failed to catch it? You're wasting everyone's time." His eyes swept across the room with disdain before locking on Nora, who stood near the whiteboard, visibly tense. She clutched a stack of error logs tightly, her fingers pale under the pressure, but still tried to speak, her voice so small it was nearly swallowed by the thick air. "I reviewed everything but the batch deployment parameters," Oliver cut her off with a dismissive wave, his lips curling into a mocking smile. "Stop making excuses. Some people simply aren't fit for this job, and unfortunately you're one of them." A faint chuckle came from the far end of the table, quickly silenced when Oliver shot a sharp glare. No one dared to intervene. Everyone kept their heads down, eyes glued to their laptop screens, pretending to be busy, anything to avoid being pulled into the confrontation. But then, from the far side of the table, a calm, steady voice broke the suffocating quiet like a blade slicing through the air. "I checked the logs last night. The error wasn't Nora's fault." Every head turned toward the speaker, Ethan Cole, the newcomer who had only been with the team for 3 weeks. Sitting upright, his gaze steady on Oliver, he spoke without hesitation, his tone level and clear. "The configuration reset during batch deployment, that's not a QA mistake." His words landed like a slap against the room's long-standing silence. Oliver slowly turned to face him, surprise flashing briefly across his face before his expression hardened. "And who do you think you are to correct me in front of everyone? You're just a rookie here to learn, not to judge." His voice dropped lower, each word sharp and deliberate, like a knife aimed straight at Ethan. But Ethan didn't flinch. He held Oliver's gaze, calm and unshaken. The tension in the room grew so thick it felt like no one dared to breathe. Someone whispered under their breath, almost too quietly to hear, "That's brave." Oliver narrowed his eyes, pausing for a few seconds as if weighing his response, then turned away, continuing the meeting as if Ethan's words had never been spoken. But everyone knew nothing could erase that moment. For the first time, someone had dared to speak the truth, even if the price might be his own career. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the large glass windows of the Ardent Systems lobby, but it did nothing to warm the cold atmosphere. Ethan Cole sat quietly in the corner of the office, his eyes fixed on the lines of code on his screen, deliberately ignoring the furtive glances from his coworkers. At 11 o'clock, a notification popped up in the corner of his laptop. He clicked it open. The message was short, clinical. "Due to violating team cohesion guidelines and negatively affecting workplace morale, your contract is hereby terminated effective immediately. Please contact HR to complete the exit procedure." Below it was HR's electronic signature, cold, impersonal, with no further explanation. Ethan took a deep breath, his expression remaining strangely calm. He closed the laptop, stood, and began to pack his things slowly, methodically, as if he didn't want to leave a single trace behind. That very composure, however, unsettled a few people. One coworker quickly ducked his head when Ethan's gaze passed by, while another opened his mouth to speak but thought better of it, afraid of being dragged into trouble. No one said goodbye. No one shook his hand, only quick, guilty glances avoiding his eyes. He hung his employee badge neatly on the rack, placed his half-finished coffee cup, a white ceramic mug with the company logo still faintly warm, back on his desk. Just as he was about to leave, he noticed a folded piece of paper tucked beneath his keyboard. Opening it, he saw a small, delicate handwriting. "Thank you for standing up for me. Nora." Ethan stared at the note for a moment, the corner of his lips lifting slightly into a faint smile, though his eyes held something deeper, not regret, but certainty. He turned and walked out, his shoes striking the floor with a steady rhythm that echoed down the long hallway. No one stood to see him off, and no one dared to meet his eyes. To them, Ethan was just a foolish newcomer who didn't understand the unspoken rules here. But what they didn't know was that the man they had just quietly pushed out of those doors wasn't just an ordinary employee. He was the only person with the power to decide the future of the entire tech empire. The glass doors closed behind Ethan Cole, reflecting the figure of a man walking into the pale midday sunlight of the city. But as his footsteps echoed on the stone steps, a subtle change unfolded, no longer the posture of a recently fired employee, but the confident presence, tinged with authority, of someone accustomed to making decisions that could change an entire industry. A sleek, black car waited at the curb, its driver quickly stepping out to open the door, bowing slightly. "Welcome back, Mr. Blake." Ethan gave a brief nod, his eyes cold and sharp as glass. His real name was not Ethan Cole. He was Adrian Blake, the founder and CEO of Ardent Systems, one of the fastest-growing tech empires on the East Coast of the United States. From a cramped garage with nothing but an old laptop, he had built a multi-billion-dollar empire, but in the process, he had been pushed further and further away from the real lives of the workers he had once stood alongside. Sitting in the luxurious car, Adrian removed the cheap black-rimmed glasses and smoothed back the hair he had deliberately left messy for weeks. The worn hoodie now looked out of place on a man who was accustomed to tailored suits. He leaned back against the seat, his eyes gazing distantly through the bulletproof glass as the city blurred past. In his mind, every moment of his undercover days resurfaced the quiet sighs of frustrated employees, the silence they maintained in the face of injustice, and the moment he stood up for Nora in that meeting. Each memory cut into his pride like a blade. He closed his eyes briefly, letting out a heavy sigh. For years, Adrian had only seen polished reports and carefully edited statistics meant to keep the board of directors satisfied. He had believed in those numbers until he witnessed firsthand Nora being humiliated, young employees silenced, and the truth twisted by men like Oliver Kane. A cold smile crept across his face, his eyes glinting with steely determination. "They think I'm just a CEO sitting too high to understand. Their biggest mistake was underestimating me." The car turned onto the road leading to the company's headquarters. Adrian unlocked his phone, scrolling quickly through the flood of emails ignored during his undercover mission. His fingers stopped at a private folder filled with notes, photos, and evidence he had collected. He whispered under his breath, his tone firm and unyielding. "The game is only beginning, and I, not Oliver Kane, hold the final move." That evening, Adrian Blake sat alone in his spacious penthouse in the heart of the city, a place so perfectly arranged it felt almost lifeless. The towering glass walls reflected the soft golden light, but it did nothing to warm his restless mind. On the table lay a thick leather notebook, open to pages filled with strong, deliberate handwriting. Some strokes pressed so deeply into the paper, they betrayed the anger he had been holding back. He flipped through the pages, his eyes lingering on the notes. Nora Ellis, publicly blamed for a mistake she didn't make. Kevin R., new employee, forced into silence. QA department fear dominating, no one dares to speak. The short lines were enough to expose the harsh truth his company had become a machine that consumed people, and he had allowed it to happen. Adrian set the pen down and leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the city outside, still glowing brightly like a cold giant running on nothing but lifeless numbers. He thought of the early days when Ardent Systems was just a small office with a few worn wooden desks. Back then, he and his young colleagues worked through sleepless nights, unafraid of mistakes, unafraid of being criticized. Heated debates always ended with handshakes and laughter. Now the company had over 500 employees, but instead of freedom and passion, all he saw was hesitation, even fear. He lifted a glass of wine, swirling the amber liquid slowly, his eyes glinting with a trace of bitterness. "We lost the most valuable thing, trust, and the courage to speak the truth. And that failure started with me," he thought, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He had once believed that reports and strategic meetings were enough to sustain a good company, but the reality he had witnessed firsthand had shattered that naive belief. A cold breeze drifted in as Adrian opened the window slightly, exhaling a long, steady breath. His eyes sharpened, no longer tired, but glinting like a freshly honed blade. He closed the notebook, placing it firmly on the table, and his voice, low but filled with ironclad resolve, echoed through the quiet room. If I want to save this company, I have to shatter the false shell I created, and I will start with the first person who dared to trample on its values. Early the next morning, Adrian Blake sat in his private office on the top floor of the headquarters, the silence so complete that the ticking of the wall clock sounded like a countdown to an impending war. On the wide laptop screen before him were countless files, neatly organized into folders, photos, audio recordings, detailed notes. Each file was a piece of the larger picture, a map of the rot eating away at the very company he had built with his own hands. There was a photo of Nora Ellis standing frozen by the whiteboard, her eyes red and swollen, slack conversations where Oliver Kane mocked and belittled his subordinates, and whispered exchanges in meetings where people scrambled to shift blame just to protect themselves, all laid bare, leaving no room for excuses. Adrian's eyes lingered on a specific audio recording he had secretly captured during his undercover days. Oliver's voice, lowered but dripping with arrogance. "We don't need self-righteous heroes. A single rumor is enough to bury their careers." Laughter followed, smug and cruel, making Adrian's fist tighten until his knuckles turned white. He had once believed people like Oliver were a minority, but what he had seen proved otherwise. A culture of fear had become an unspoken rule within the company he founded. The sunlight streaming through the glass window behind him cast half his face in light, leaving the other half shadowed. Leaning back in his chair, Adrian stared at the ceiling as if questioning himself. How long have I allowed this to happen? How many talented people have been crushed before I finally decided to look? Anger mixed with regret surged through him, but he quickly pushed it aside, replacing it with something sharper, colder, the focused determination of a predator finally locking onto its true prey. Reaching for the leather notebook, he wrote one more line in firm, decisive strokes. Justice doesn't come from speeches or reports. It starts with a direct strike. Closing the notebook, Adrian fixed his gaze on the screen, his deep voice breaking the stillness of the room. "All right, Oliver, you want to play by the rules of silence? I'll shatter that silence starting with you." That morning, a notification flashed across Oliver Kane's computer screen, making him freeze. Just one short line, no formal title, no explanation. Executive Meeting Room 12A, 8 a.m. Sender, A. Blake. Oliver blinked several times, his heart pounding faster than usual. That name was not one that just anyone could casually summon. Adrian Blake, the CEO of Ardent Systems, a man Oliver had only ever seen in formal portraits on the company website and during the occasional rare online conference. When he stepped into Meeting Room 12A, Oliver immediately felt the difference. The atmosphere was nothing like the meetings he was used to. The curtains were drawn shut, the warm yellow light falling across the long wooden table, casting strange shadows. At the head of the table sat Adrian Blake, not in the usual sharp, tailored suit, but in a simple white shirt, his hands clasped together on the table. But it was that very simplicity, combined with the cold, cutting gaze in his eyes, like a blade freshly drawn from its sheath, that made Oliver's chest tighten. "Sit." Adrian's voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of authority, compelling Oliver to obey without hesitation. His movements stiff, Oliver pulled out a chair. He forced a polite smile, but it immediately faded under Adrian's piercing stare. Without any pleasantries, Adrian slid a thin folder across the table toward him. Printed in bold on the cover were the words, "Internal Accounts QA Department." Oliver frowned slightly, opening it. His face drained of color as soon as he saw the printed Slack conversations, line by line, undeniable. Some of them were messages he himself had typed. "That guy thinks he's a hero. Don't worry, HR will take care of him. Company culture is just an excuse. Just fire the troublemakers and be done with it." Adrian didn't rush to speak. He simply let Oliver read, waiting until beads of sweat began to form at his temples. Finally, Adrian's voice cut through the heavy silence, steady and cold. "I sat in your meetings. I heard every word you said. I watched how you crushed your employees. Do you have anything to say for yourself, Oliver?" A long pause followed, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock. Oliver opened his mouth, stammering, I didn't know you." But Adrian interrupted instantly, his voice low, carrying the weight of a threat. "That's right. You didn't know me. That's the problem. You thought you could do anything without consequences because you believed I would never show up. But I'm here now, and I've seen enough." Oliver swallowed hard, fear clearly written across his face. He knew this was no ordinary meeting. This was judgment. The air in meeting room 12A was thick, as if every particle was waiting for the judgment about to be delivered. Oliver Kane sat there, his hands clasped together, trembling slightly. He tried to control his breathing, but his shoulders shook with every shallow inhale and his eyes darted away, unable to meet the gaze of the man across from him. Adrian Blake sat unmoving, his elbows resting on the table, fingers interlocked, his expression calm yet deep and piercing, as though he could see straight through every thought in Oliver's mind. "Oliver," Adrian began, his voice low but firm, "I once believed people like you could help Ardent Systems grow. But what I've seen isn't leadership. It's someone abusing authority to keep fear alive. You haven't just hurt employees, you've destroyed the very core values this company was built on." Oliver opened his mouth, his voice shaky. I only did what was necessary to maintain order. There are always people who don't fit. Adrian raised a hand, cutting him off, his gaze sharp enough to make Oliver hold his breath. "Stop justifying yourself. You didn't maintain order. You created a system where people had to stay silent to survive. And I didn't build this company to turn it into that kind of place." Adrian took a slow breath and gave a small nod, his voice dropping, each word landing like the strike of a blade. "Effective immediately, you are reassigned to the restructuring department at the Boston branch. You will have no staff under your authority, no strategic approval rights, and you will be required to complete a 3-month management ethics training program. Consider this your last chance." Oliver's face drained of color. His lips parted as if to protest, but Adrian didn't give him the chance. Standing, his movements deliberate and commanding, Adrian's voice dropped lower, colder. "And Oliver, if I hear one more complaint about how you treat employees, I won't call you into a meeting to talk. Next time you'll receive a termination notice. Is that clear?" Oliver nodded quickly, his voice catching in his throat. I understand." He looked like a child caught doing something wrong, small and powerless, a complete contrast to the man who had once stood in meetings humiliating colleagues without mercy. Adrian said nothing more, giving him one last glance before turning and walking out of the room. The meeting room door closed behind him, leaving Oliver sitting there in stunned silence. In that moment, he understood that this empire no longer belonged to those who thrived on fear and manipulation. It had returned to the hands of the man who had built it. The company-wide conference was held in the largest auditorium of Ardent Systems. Hundreds of employees filled the rows of seats, soft murmurs rippling through the air. On stage, a massive LED screen displayed the familiar company logo, beneath which stood a dark wooden podium, the place where whoever stood there would decide not just the direction of the company, but the future of its culture. When Adrian Blake stepped out, the room fell almost instantly silent. He was not dressed in an expensive suit or a crisp tie, but in a simple light blue shirt and dark khaki pants, the same kind of outfit he had worn during his Undercover days as Ethan Cole. Standing at the podium, his hands rested lightly on the wood, his eyes swept across the entire hall. Some faces looked curious, others uncertain, and a few carried visible worry. "Good morning, everyone." His voice was warm yet firm, each word echoing throughout the auditorium. "I want to tell you a story about an employee named Ethan Cole." A stir moved through the crowd, several people lifting their heads, their faces showing surprise at the familiar name. Adrian continued. "He joined the QA department less than a month ago. He worked hard, quietly, never seeking attention. But one day he stood up for a colleague who was wrongly blamed, and for that he was fired. The entire hall seemed drawn into every word he spoke. Adrian paused for a beat, his eyes growing deeper, his tone dropping lower but carrying weight with every syllable. "I am Ethan Cole." The statement landed like a bomb. A wave of murmurs surged across the hall. Some people's mouths fell open, others exchanged shocked glances. While those who had been present in that infamous meeting lowered their heads, shame etched across their faces. Adrian allowed the commotion to linger for a few seconds before raising his hand, signaling silence. "I didn't go undercover to test anyone," he continued, his voice steady and resonant. "I did it to see this company through your eyes. And what I saw..." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the crowd, his brows furrowing. "Broke my heart, not because of mistakes in work, but because we have lost the most important thing, the courage to speak the truth and the kindness to treat one another with respect." He lifted his head, his voice ringing out with resolve. "That changes today." A wave of silence rolled across the hall. No one spoke, but something shifted in many of their eyes, fear slowly giving way to hope. The hall remained utterly silent after Adrian Blake's powerful declaration. The stage lights shone directly on where he stood, casting his tall figure in a long shadow across the wooden floor. Adrian took a deep breath before speaking again, his voice low but clear, cutting through the frozen air like a blade. "But I cannot do this alone. We need people who are willing to uphold the right values even when everything stands against them, and there is someone who has done exactly that." Adrian's gaze shifted to the front row where Nora Ellis sat. Her expression flickered with unease, her eyes instinctively wanting to look away, yet they were drawn to his steady, unwavering look. "Nora Ellis, please join me on stage." Adrian's tone was not a request, it carried the weight of respect, an honor for someone who deserved to be recognized. All eyes in the hall turned toward Nora. She stood slowly, walking step by step toward the stage. Her face showed a hint of nervousness and her hands trembled slightly as they touched the edge of the podium. But when Adrian looked at her, his eyes filled with trust and gratitude, and that gave her the strength to steady herself. Adrian reached into his pocket, pulling out a new employee badge. Placing it on the podium, he spoke firmly, his words ringing with conviction. "Nora Ellis, you did what no one else dared to do. You stood by the truth, even when you were being crushed for it. Starting today, you will take on the role of Head of Cultural Reformation at Ardent Systems." A brief silence followed. Then the sound of applause erupted, hesitant at first, but quickly spreading through the hall like a rising wave. Some employees stood, clapping not out of politeness, but out of something much deeper, the recognition of someone who had the courage to do what was right. Nora looked at Adrian, her eyes glistening, though no tears fell. Instead, she tightened her grip around the new badge, nodding firmly. "I will not let anyone down." Adrian's expression softened, a small smile crossing his face. "I am not asking you to fix what is broken. I am asking you to help us rebuild it the way we once started." Applause rose again, louder this time, echoing through the hall like a promise, marking this moment as one that would forever be remembered in the history of Ardent Systems. A week after that pivotal conference, Ardent Systems was no longer a place filled with fear and silence. The glass walls reflected the morning light, but this time, instead of averted gazes, the hallways buzzed with conversation. Meetings that had once been tense and oppressive now echoed with candid debates. Young employees who had once only bowed their heads and followed orders were now raising their hands to ask questions. And through it all, Adrian Blake was present, not as a distant CEO, but as a colleague willing to listen. He walked slowly through the open workspace, without an entourage of assistants, without any formal announcement. Adrian stopped to discuss a system improvement idea with a young engineer, leaned over a QA employee's desk to hear their analysis of a bug report, and even sat down to have lunch with a group of programmers in the cafeteria. Every time he passed by, the eyes that had once watched him with caution now held genuine respect, not for the position he held, but for being someone who truly cared. At one point, Adrian paused outside Nora Ellis's new office. The glass door was slightly ajar, and through it he saw Nora talking with a group of employees. She wasn't speaking much, just leaning in to listen, occasionally nodding or jotting notes in her notebook. Adrian smiled faintly, a rare smile filled with hope. The woman who had once been humiliated in front of everyone now stood at the center of the company's rebuilding efforts, and those around her were beginning to regain the trust they had lost. Adrian turned away and continued down the hall, his gaze drifting toward the end where framed photographs of the company's history lined the walls. In his heart, a vow echoed, not meant for the crowd or the press, but for himself. No one in this company will ever have to sacrifice their career just to speak the truth. Not ever again. He walked slowly, the soft sound of his shoes blending into the lively energy that now filled the air. Conversations, laughter, and the exchange of ideas resonated throughout the building like the soundtrack of a new beginning. Adrian knew the road ahead would be long and full of challenges, but for the first time in years, he believed Ardent Systems was finally on the right path not because of growth reports, but because of the people who had found the courage to stand for what was right. And as the morning sunlight streamed through the clear glass reflecting off the plaque that bore the name Ardent Systems, it no longer felt like just a logo, it was a promise of a new era, beginning at that very moment. In business, technology may change every day, but culture and people are what truly determine a company's survival. A strong organization does not thrive because of impressive reports, but because of the people who dare to speak the truth and protect the right values even when it comes at a cost. If you believe the truth deserves to be heard, hit like and subscribe to join us in sharing more inspiring stories. And don't forget to leave a comment below with the words "Dare to Speak," because sometimes a single sentence is enough to change an entire system.